Hello and welcome to Glorious Miniatures, and in today's video we'll be painting up one of the dogs from Hexbane's Hunters, which is one of the warbands in Warhammer Underworlds. Folks, if you don't want to miss out on any future videos, do make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell for notifications and you won't miss anything in the future. Now, without further ado, let's just get into it. Okay, starting off with Rakarth flesh, we're going to use that to start off with painting these wounds to begin with, or deep scars, whatever. They're either healed up or they're fresh wounds. In the end, I paint them up as fresh wounds. But whatever we're going to end up with, Rakarth flesh is the start point. Wait for the first layer to dry. My particular version of Rakarth flesh is pretty thinned down, and it takes at least, well, it's definitely 2 coats, but I think this was potentially the 3rd. Regardless, once we've done that, we'll move on to the next thing, which is Rhinox hide, and we're going to do that on the dog's collar. The other dog in Hexbane Hunters has a sort of chest harness on of some variety, but this is just a dog color, just a standard one. Paint this on. If you make any little mistakes, obviously you can clean it up with some Abaddon black in a bit. All right, so just making sure we got a nice even coat on that Rhinox hide. Well, moving on to the next bit. I think that's, yeah, that looks pretty good to me. Okay, and Leadbelcher. We've got a couple of little metal pieces on this dog collar to paint. So these little studs, for example, need to be done. There's, I don't know how many. There's a bunch of little studs around the collar, and then there's this shackle bit to keep it closed. Whatever, I can't even, the buckle, that's what you call it. The buckle to paint, the studs, and that's about it metal-wise on this miniature. And then if you make any little mistakes, just get that Rhinox hide and tidy it up. Before moving on to Abaddon black, where we start putting down the basic colour of the entire miniature. It is over black primer, so if you are asking why I'm painting it, it's just because I like the finish of the Abaddon black compared to the primer. I know some people might just be happy to leave it at using the primer. But I don't really believe in that, so that's why we use the base coat of Abaddon black. Tidy up vaguely around this scar. I know in the future I will be tidying up around this anyway, so I don't need to stress too much about being really neat right here. I will be returning to that point pretty shortly to tidy it up again. I know I did struggle a little bit, and I took that as an advantage. And then Reikland fleshshade. Okay, so we work this into the wounds or the scars. Nice. Obviously, I put in a huge amount right there. Make sure it is in those recesses. And if you want to, you can come back with a wet brush like I'm doing right now, or a damp brush, and wick away any excess if you really want to. I do it just out of habit, really. And now I'm going back with Abaddon black to tidy up those scars. As you can see, I left them earlier. Obviously, I waited for the Reikland fleshshade to dry before coming into this stage and tidying up the scar tissue or the wound, whatever you want to call it. Let's take a bit of time to make sure that Reikland fleshshade is dry, otherwise it would cause a few problems. There we go. That looks like it's pretty much on the way to getting finished. Ready for the next stage. Make sure got everything tidied up to the point where you need it, and then we can move on to XV88. This is, we're going to paint the socks, or whatever you call these things, around the feet, as you can see on this bit of stock image. And this is the general paint scheme we're going to go with on this dog. So we've got to paint some of this brown around the muzzle. As you can see, it's thinned down a little bit. You are going to require a couple of different coats, no doubt, but paint roughly the scheme if you got some reference to copy. And then you got these little sort of eyebrow things, I don't know what you would call them, but get a couple of coats on those eyebrows, coming back with a second coat on the muzzle and everywhere else. I know we got the bits on the chest to paint as well. These dogs have a couple of patches there which you'll need to paint as I've painted, and then I'm tidying up any little mistakes right now with some Abaddon black, and I'm also scratching in some sort of little hairs, I guess, or whatever you would like to call them, to help blend the brown and the black layers together to make sure it's not quite such a harsh line between the two different colours, as you can see. And then now we're going to move on to Reikland fleshshade. We're going to use this as our shade for the brown parts of this scheme. Try and wick away any excess so it's not left quite as I left it quite pooled there at the moment, but I did come back with a brush and removed any sort of huge amounts of paint. Make sure you go over all of the brown patches and it'll tone things quite nicely for us. It doesn't matter if you get a bit more into that scar tissue as well, or that wound or whatever it is. Okay, that's looking pretty good. I do like the shade it's going. Just one coat is all you're going to need. Remove any excess and then move on to the next bit. As you can see, it is drying right now. And then once it's dried, you can move on to the next stage, which is back to XV88. We're going to start bringing that sort of yellowish color back in. We're going to leave that Reikland fleshshade in the shadow, unsurprisingly. Don't forget to paint those little toes. Got to paint the muzzle. So we're going to do lots of parallel lines going down from the top of the nose, top of the muzzle, to the lips, moving in parallel little lines to sort of replicate some fur. Carrying on with the chest, working from like the center of the chest outwards, and then doing the other side of the muzzle, which we didn't do. You can do a couple of different coats. You don't have to get each individual line painted twice. It doesn't matter. It can build up some texture, which is always a good thing. And you can paint over onto that black as well to sort of blur that line where the two colors meet. As you can see right there, it's starting to come together slowly. Let's get that bit there. And then Balor brown is basically the next color we're going to use. We're going to use that on any sort of faces, any surfaces sort of facing upwards where we want to add a bit of brightness. If you want to add some more texture. So I'm just going to paint those upward facing bits of the leg right there. Some of the bits of the bottom of the foot down there, I guess, or whatever, the lower leg. And we're going to add some more texture. We're going to do some more parallel lines on the muzzle, crossing over the brown and starting off in the, we can start off in the black as well, crossing down into the previous colors of the XV88, etc. It does help blend things together quite nicely, in my humble opinion. But yeah, as it's always good to get some reference, especially when it comes to painting animals, like which direction the hair tends to grow, which way it falls, etc. This is a short-haired dog, relatively short-haired dog, so we don't have huge patches of fur. It's all quite close together, and it's looking pretty good. Moving on to Skavenblight dinge, we are going to start painting the black bits of hair. I've just mentioned a few times, painting black can be an issue. So we're going to start off painting up all of the kind of high points, the raised areas, all of the sort of raised muscular bits, like that. Short little strokes, as you can see, like that. And just work your way around. You can use the light from above as a sort of general guideline to get the hair where you would like it. As long as you sort of vaguely get the hair moving in the right direction, it won't look too wrong if you're concerned about that. Around the face, we've got the brows, cheekbones, we've got to paint the tail, we've got to paint the back of the leg. And there we go, the top of the eyebrows there. Eyebrows, the brow. It's looking pretty good. Getting there slowly. Let's get the front of that back leg as well right there. Add a bit of definition. Before moving on to Stormvermin fur, this is going to be our second highlight for this. We're going to be painting this over the previous colors. Apart from the ears, we're going to be doing little dashes all over the previous color. As you can see, keep it within the previous color. So you don't want to go out of it too much if you can help it. You want to stay within that Skavenblight dinge highlight that we did before. Get the top of the muzzle, get those brows. Get the back of the dog's leg as much as you can. All adds some nice little texture. I think it's coming together quite nicely. So yeah, building up texture is the name of the game. And obviously, like depending on the age of the dog as well, it can lead into how well its coat looks, how its diet, how shiny it is, and all of that sort of stuff. If it's got a healthy diet, you can put some white scar on. We're going to use this to sort of add a bit of a glisten, a bit of a gloss to the coat. We don't go too glossy on this. I could be as though he's going to Crufts or something. We could do very glossy coat, but I'm just doing a bit of white highlighting on some of this coat to sort of add a bit of gloss, a bit of a sheen to it. I think it works. So just get it. You could kind of make it in a vague sort of line as it's running along the body. It's kind of hard to explain, but I'm just kind of vaguely doing it in a rough line of where the light would fall and that sort of stuff. I reckon it looks pretty good. What do you think, folks? Let me know. Am I doing this incorrectly? But I'm happy. And now we're going to do some Fortress Grey. Do you know where this is going? Yeah, right on the end of the nose. You guessed it, correct. So, a healthy dog is going to have a wet nose, or a somewhat wet nose, I guess. So we're just going to add a tiny little bit of a shiny point on the nose. So a bit of a grey dot. That's all it is. And then within that grey dot, yep, you guessed it, white scar. Just a tiny dot of white. Like that. That's basically all I'm going to do. It's basically all I'm going to do. I suppose you could do the the inside of the nostril if you really wanted to. But let's get the Skrag brown out and add a bit of texture onto this dog collar. We're not going to really put a huge amount of detail into this collar. It's already got a tiny bit of metal on. We're not going to be shading it a huge amount, so just put some little scratches across the shorter length of the width of the collar, I guess, to sort of indicate cracks and stuff like that. I wouldn't personally put any long scratches within the collar, if that makes any sense. I'd certainly obviously edge highlight like I was just doing, but not I wouldn't do many long lines along the length of the collar. It doesn't make sense to me. So horizontal kind of scratches, yes, not necessarily long ones. Anyway, build up that texture. A couple of different coats are probably required. It's really up to you and the consistency of your own paint. I reckon it's coming together quite nicely though. Let's see. Now we move on to Doombull Brown. We're going to paint this eye. Okay. He just has the one eye, the poor dog. So we're going to put in this deep reddish brown color as a basis for our eye. We're not going to go too crazy with this, I promise. So just make sure you get it from both sides. Work that little bit of Doombull Brown in there. It's not a huge space to put paint in, so we don't have to spend too much time. Question is, do we do a pupil or an iris? I'm not going to on this particular one, but what I am going to do is use some white scar to do a little bit of a glint, on the eye. So I'm going to put this tiny little white dot on the eye, like so. So, yes, like that. Now, I think it works. I think it probably would work if I was able to put an iris underneath it. I think it might work even better in that situation. What do you reckon? Does that look vaguely all right? I really like how this dog's looking. And so I'm going to move on to the next step, which is the basing with Mechanicus Standard Grey. As you can see, I've already got the base painted grey. I've already got Nuln oil on it. So you know vaguely what's about to happen. I was doing a bit of batch painting. I got carried away. And turns out I have to come back and do this bit for the video. So here we go. Get a couple of thin coats of this Mechanicus Standard Grey onto the base. This is thinned down a fair amount, so you're going to probably need a couple of coats. Obviously, as always, depends on the consistency of your own paint. And we do have a slight issue with the footage coming up. Unfortunately, I don't know what happened, but you will notice under his right foot, there is a sort of a bit of a puddle. But we'll get to that after the next sort of step. So Nuln oil, give this entire surface a good coverage of paint of this wash. Make sure it runs into all the cracks and grooves. Make sure it coats the entire surface in a relatively even fashion. Wick away any excess. See, right around that rock, there was a bit too much, so I removed it with the brush. And then once you've done that, you can leave it to dry. Make sure you got an even coat like that. As I was saying, there is a bit of an issue with the puddle. A bit of footage went a bit wonky, or I painted something in an incorrect order, so I will try and go over it. It's not a huge deal, though. But once that has dried, we can go back to Mechanicus Standard Grey, and we are going to start bringing in the main tones of this base. So all over those stones, we want to give it a decent amount of coverage. We want to paint all over the flagstones as well. We do want to leave the Nuln oil in the crevices between the flagstones, and I like to leave a bit of the Nuln oil on the actual surface of the flagstone as well to add a bit of tonal variation across the sort of the area of the flagstone. I think it adds a bit more visual interest, which is an important thing when painting miniatures. So as you can see, there is a ripple under his foot. Okay, it's a sculpted in ripple, so you can start to highlight that now if you wanted to, or in the next stage or the following stage. Just have to paint a couple of little circles. They are raised, so it's basically just painting around, being somewhat neat. I waited, I think, until the next stage. I just missed the footage. Talking of the next stage, here it is, Dawnstone. I like to edge highlight the edge of the base like that. We're also going to add in some brightness to these stones. We're going to be doing 2 or 3 layers. This paint is somewhat thinned down, so I don't really mind doing multiple layers because each layer is slightly thinner than the other, and it sort of all adds a bit more brightness than the previous layer as you build them up. You could potentially paint the puddle, the ripple. You're only going to be painting it basically in black and white tones, essentially, or well, grey tones really, and with a view to the painting the last bit of the tutorial really. But paint those edge highlights, do a bit of edge highlighting, paint those rocks, do as many layers as you really want to build up the brightness of these stones. If you make any mistakes, it's not a big deal. You can always go back over it with some Nuln oil if you wanted to, or Mechanicus, standard Mechanicus grey, whatever you want. Once you've done that and waited for it to dry, you can move on to Fortress Grey, which is the paint I have. It's very thin down, but you probably don't have that. You've probably got something like Administratum Grey, which is, I believe, its current version. So I'm going to use that to do more edge highlighting. Going to add some more colour to or brightness to those stones, more edge highlighting along the flagstones. This is when I would definitely be painting that puddle under his right foot. You can see it right there. It's just got Nuln oil on it. Make sure you go around it with at least this colour. Just paint a couple of little circles over the raised parts, and you'll see why in a second. Or you don't really have to. You could leave it if you really wanted to. It's entirely up to you. But make sure you've done all the edge highlighting. Bring that brightness onto this base using some more layers of Administratum Grey. There we go. That's looking pretty good. Okay, now Athonian camoshade, folks. Now I will have matte varnished this miniature. I use matte varnish. I don't really like to leave miniatures unvarnished. So what I did was I matte varnished the miniature. Then I came and put the Athonian camo shade over the puddle. And I also added the Athonian camo shade a bit into these crevices of the flagstones. Just to add a bit more variation on them. Just to break it up a little bit. You can do that as well. Athonian camo shade, Agrax earth shade. Any of these sorts of earthy, natural colours you can wash over the surface of the flagstones to change things up a little bit. It's very easy. Once you've done that, you wait for it to dry. That's all you have to do. We're going to move on to the next step, which is gloss acrylic varnish. So once that previous layer is dried, this is a bit of footage which is slightly weird. I hadn't painted on the Athonian camo shade at this point for some reason. Not entirely sure what was going on in my brain. Something was definitely wonky. However, imagine that it has been done. Now you're painting the acrylic gloss varnish over that puddle colour, and that will hopefully provide a bit of a glint to our finished miniature. And here is the finished result. I have added one extra thing. You don't have to do this. But I saw a pot of it and thought I had to use it because I rarely use it. And you'll see that in a second once I turn the mini around. I'm really happy with the bit of this glisten on the coat. I did add a bit of blood for the blood god. I rarely use blood effects. I'm not entirely sold on them. Sometimes they look okay, sometimes they don't. It's something I've got to practice with, really. And I'm just trying to show you a bit of that glossy puddle right there. I don't know if you can... Oh, there's a bit of a glisten right there. I suppose I could have added more and things might be a bit more obvious. But as I was saying, I like the glossy coat. Could have made it glossier potentially. I like the bit of a shiny nose and I like the eye. Folks, thanks so much for hanging out with me as we painted up one of the dogs from Hexbane's Hunters. We did get there in the end. I think we did lose a bit of footage or some of it went a bit wonky. I do apologise for that. But we got there in the end. Folks, if you haven't already, do make sure you've looked below, liked and subscribed, and hit the bell for notifications, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you, and goodbye. It's the one.